The SDG 5 pledge to accelerate women's leadership in the UAE private sector is a rather remarkable co-designed initiative emerging from the Private Sector Advisory Council and the National Committee on the Sustainable Development Goals. To give you a little bit of insight on this initiative, and Elena will also do that in a moment, the UAE's National Committee on the SDGs recognized that in order to make measurable progress in meeting our 2030 agenda, we had to work with the private sector. And so a group of local and multinational companies came together in 2019 to decide what they would focus on for the next few years. And for the UAE, for the private sector, and for the government, the priority became the advancement of gender balance, but specifically the closing of leadership gaps in the UAE, because we had them here like we do everywhere around the world. And so the initiative that was co-designed was this pledge, with a target of 30% of senior and middle management roles being held by women by the year 2025. But in order to meet this target, a series of policy priorities were identified. So signatories of the pledge, of which there are 56 to date, are committing not just to meeting the target, but also to looking at their pay and compensation practices. They're committing to reviewing their internal strategy. They're committing to looking at their recruitment and promotion practices. And for me, being the policy person that I am, most excitingly, they're committing to sharing qualitative and quantitative data, because the UAE government is committed to evidence-based policy reform. And this helps us. It helps us to know where the gaps are, it helps us to know what the private sector needs, and ultimately it helps us to meet not just our gender balance goals, but our broader economic advancement goals. So to start, I will turn to you, Elena, to please let us know a little bit more from your perspective on the development of this initiative, because you were one of the founding members of the council.
Thank you, Ayesha. When we first gathered as the Private Sector Advisory Council, it actually started in 2018, and we determined through our work that actually focusing on gender was an area where the UAE was already leading, but could make even greater steps in a leadership role to advancing gender parity. And so we really took it upon ourselves to make it a collaborative process from the very start. And this was a multi-year exercise, Ayesha. It wasn't something that we decided and then 12 months later it came out fully baked. No. We did focus groups with members, extended members of the private sector to help us really define what the challenges were that they were facing and to help us sharpen our focus on how we could advance gender parity. And one of these key elements that came out was the Gender Balance Pledge. And it was something that was designed through continued consultation with the private sector, so that when we launched it, and Her Excellency Mona Almari championed it, it was something that already had the support of the private sector members who'd been involved in its development. And I think this is one of the critical factors of success that we've had through the pledge, and it's represented in the number of signatories already in just the first year of its existence, is that we had a journey together, public and private sector, to create the guidelines that we wanted in order to address this. And it's important to note, the pledge is a voluntary pledge. This is not something that the private sector is going to be legally held to account for, but it's something that they've willingly signed up for in support of gender equality and gender parity. I think it's a very unique public-private partnership in that sense.
Thank you, Elena. I'll turn to you, Matthew. As Managing Director for Russell Reynolds, based out of Dubai and in the region, your organization, not just here, but globally, has really been at the forefront of identifying trends. So your organization developed the titles Chief Sustainability Officer, Chief Diversity Officer, well before these conversations were happening, not just socially and politically, but across education institutions and government. So from that kind of higher level vantage point, I'm interested to hear from you how you think leadership roles have evolved in recent years in the region. But perhaps more importantly, looking to the future, do you think that we are equipped and actually sufficiently gender balanced in our leadership pipelines and in our employee pipelines to meet some of the new demands that are coming for more future-oriented roles?
Great, thank you. I think on that point, we're we're very fortunate that one, the government has taken the lead both in terms of ministerial roles and gender balance. What you need is role modeling. Ultimately, we have role models now in government, which is fantastic to see. I think from a private, so in this case, the government's taking the lead. The private sector is following by some of the initiatives that we've seen with women on boards, women in leadership, some quotas at a local level, which is important now for listed companies, and that's putting pressure on the private sector and organizations like us to make sure that those women are available for those positions, that are trained, that are educated, and that are interested in those opportunities. And what we see from our experience globally, and in particular what's happening in the US, is you're seeing a huge shift where organizations are recognizing that having higher proportions of female leaders leads to better and more profitable business. And that's becoming now well documented. So ultimately what I think we will see is probably a point where in the private sector organizations will be publishing their gender statistics and then measure it against them by not only their own internal stakeholders but external shareholders. So you'll see stakeholder activism around this, in time. So I think there's a great opportunity. Look how far sustainability has come in a very short period of time and how people are measuring it and putting out. So I think gender will go exactly the same way.
Thank you. Your point to organizations paying increasing importance to gender diversity across, the pipeline. We of course need more women in leadership roles everywhere in the world, but we know that you need to do exactly that. You need to build those pipelines. So that, that leads me to what I'll ask you, Sharief. As executive director of Kaman, you know the defense and security industry well, in the UAE, in the region, and around the world. And yours is a sector that is stereotyped as being very male-dominant, but it's not. And I know that you do a lot of work with young Emiratis, males and females, to really equip them with those skills to be ready to hold leadership roles in the UAE in this sector. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of those programs and how your commitment to the pledge and to this target fit in with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, thank you for the invite and for the opportunity to meet so many wonderful colleagues. I want to tell everybody that, by the way, she did not mandate for us to wear red. Happy Valentine's Day. But we are all like thinkers, and I guess we just naturally decided to kind of show the colors today. So happy Valentine's to everyone. But I've been at this journey for quite some time. I'm a retired military officer from the United States Air Force. I spent 23 years serving, and back in the 90s, very similarly in the United States, there is, a male-dominated military, and how do women kind of fulfill that support and role and being equal partners in serving any mission. UAE has taken on this pledge. Actually, the announcement to equal gender 50-50 was announced by Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid at this event many years ago. And at the time, I was the chairman of AmCham, and we put that as an initiative to say, hey, even at AmCham, we want to do this. We want to support the UAE government. We want to be lined up, and we want to have equal opportunity both for women and men based on skill set, capability, and what they can do. But I've seen that. I've been here now 14 years in the UAE. And in the UAE Armed Forces, I don't know if many of you know, there are women fighter jet pilots that fly F-16s. It's not something that happens overnight. For men, it's extremely competitive and very tough to do. You have to show skill, you have to show smarts, you have to be dedicated, you have to be a good student. And during my time in uniform, working with these young ladies, and they were back then young lieutenants, they wanted to show their space. They wanted to earn their space amongst their colleagues, not because they're women, but because they're equal, if not better. And they did. A few years back when they decided to take on the role of fighting the global war on terror and putting targets in Syria on bad guys, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, over the ambassador at the UAE embassy in Washington, D.C., went out in public and said Mariam al-Mazroui was our lead pilot flying that F-16 and fulfilled that mission, leading other uniformed members to do that. So fast forward today, again, and the point I really want to make there is that it's leadership driven. This would not have happened if it wasn't for this country taken to heart that it doesn't happen overnight. You have to plant the seeds. You have to water those seeds and be able to identify these beautiful nuggets and help them, pull them along the way to show that, you know, we're all equal based on our capability and capacity. So again, fast forward, I joined Kaman about 3 years ago. They are an aerospace defense company in the United States. They've been around for about 80 years. And we are very proud of having women and men working side by side in very technical field. So very smart engineers that build sensors, fuses, we build helicopters. And so there's a lot of precision manufacturing problem solving that takes place as a team. So a few years back, we decided that we're going to invest in the SEEDS program that Tawazun has in identifying some young Emirati engineers, men and or women, to kind of do a virtual internship, because this was during COVID. And sure enough, we signed an agreement with Tawazun. We started interviewing students at Khalifa University and a few other universities throughout the UAE. We did about 20 interviews, and the cream of the crop that came up was 2 amazing women from the Northern Emirates, engineers, future engineers. So my role was not only to hire qualified women to help us in this internship, but convince my engineers back home that this is not a waste of their time. And sure enough, during the 6 months that we had them, they gave them very tough problem sets, and they above and exceeded and came up with some new solutions that we're now implementing in our company in the United States. We are about to announce next week at IDEX a joint venture where I'm looking now to recruit and hire those engineers to come and work for us at Kaman here in Abu Dhabi to be kind of a future of what we're trying to do as an American company, but landed here in UAE in part of the defense community. So I'm sorry for the long answer, but I wanted to show an example to the audience that this is real, this is happening. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that we have to work together to kind of grow.
No, thank you for that, Sharief, particularly your reference to when His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum announced the UAE Gender Balance Council in 2015 after a workshop at this World Government Summit. We were talking about this earlier, that in the UAE, we are very target-driven, but it's not about the targets, it's about the importance of the outcomes. And it's about the initiatives and it's about the contribution of a diversity of people, men and women equally. That being said, we do know that some people and some entities are target-driven. And that means that you need to have data transparency, increasingly so, for a whole series of areas and indicators, whether it's environment or social or broader governance issues. So I'll ask you, Matthew, in a time when people are saying that they are doing this, they are saying that they are working on increasing gender balance in leadership and across the pipeline, they're saying they're working on a whole series of different indicators for a better society. What's the importance of actually collecting the data if they're saying they're doing it?
It's really important, I think, and there's a number of areas that are quite obvious that can take place. So, for example, pay. Equal pay is a great one, where organizations can demonstrate that they are equalizing pay. I know as an organization, every 2 years we benchmark pay globally, irrespective of men and women, and that's the pay grade for that grade. So I think pay is one. I think another thing that organizations can do is measure the investment they're making in training and development that's going specifically towards promoting gender equality within the organization, training around things like subconscious bias. So sometimes, you know, to your point, very often what we see is that you need men to sponsor and lift up. So do you have a program that's allowing that to happen within the organization? So as in our organization, for every man in the organization, even though we're 55% female, 45% men, every man has to have 2 female mentees that they're bringing up in the organization, somewhere in their office or outside their office. So even though we've tipped the balance in terms of our own gender equality, we're making sure that we're co-investing in that future development. So I think training and development is one, pay and benefits is another. And I think investing in, at a local level, I think investing in programs where we're looking at things like home-based violence and how that may impact on engagement. And the other thing which I think is going to come as a result of the pandemic is that in some of these sectors where women have been underrepresented, like AI or coding or some technological sectors or even defense, the ability to have flexible work policies, work from home, and engage populations wherever they are, and women wherever they are, is going to be a great opportunity, because then you can have the best of both worlds. You can have flexibility and childcare and a great job and be adding value on equal pay, irrespective of where you sit. So I think getting organizations to publish their wins, and ultimately knowing that a bit like sustainability, no one has all the answers. So ultimately, if all of the private sector partners are choosing to show what they do well, we can all learn from each other.
Thank you, Matthew. I'd like to pick up on your point about the diversity of programs that exist to support women in their careers, and ask you, Elena, when there are so many different initiatives taking place across organizations and so many different policies, what is the actual benefit of participating in an initiative like the Pledge? But also, I'd like to ask you something else, which we didn't prepare. I hope that's okay. In your role as a partner at Kearney and having been in the region for so long, you have seen how different entities operate. You have seen successes and you have undoubtedly seen failures. So how does an initiative like this contribute to closing some of these gaps, and how can we apply this framework to other challenges?
So I think a couple of thoughts on that. I think, first of all, I think there's tremendous value in a pledge like this. And, I will say, specifically for my firm, for Kearney, we committed to the pledge here in the region, but it is actually something that is also translated back into our global organization. And I think this is also where, there's significant value generated by this kind of program, because it's not just in the UAE that this is having an impact in my organization. We've launched a program called Project Vital specifically to support the development of talent, not just from an early stage recruiting standpoint, but actually looking at ways to make consulting as an industry and within our firm something that women can progress through across all stages of their career and their lives, to basically look at where we can stop some of the leakage of high quality talent that we're having at those inflection points where you do see significant attrition of women. So I think, first of all, I think a pledge like this is critical because it's got more impact than just what's happening here in the UAE, and I'm sure both Sharief and Matthew can speak to that it's also feeding back into your global organizations because of the discussions you're having here, how to meet these objectives. So I think that's the first thing. But I think it also speaks to your second question, which is, why does this help us close the gaps? Well, some of it is knowledge sharing, and that transparency that we're able to gather by bringing together best practices and data, it can't be underestimated. And I will say this has been a common thread through many of the discussions that I've been part of so far this week, but also that I've sat in. The issue of data transparency is fundamental to solving many of the challenges that have been identified, not just within gender, but in the SDGs more broadly. And it will feed into some of the later events this year in the UAE around COP28 as well. We cannot solve challenges, we cannot find solutions if we don't know where the problems really sit. And so a pledge like this helps us to create partnership between the public and private sector to create more transparency around some of these data sets that, quite frankly, while the governments around the world have massive reams of data, but there are things that they don't have access to. And if we don't create those partnerships between the public and the private sector to facilitate some of that data sharing, we're not going to be able to address these issues. And this is something that I think will only benefit us, and I think also has an implication for other applications of partnerships like this in other areas that we need to address around the Sustainable Development Goals. So lots of value from my perspective.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And you're alluding to what will be our last question in just a moment about some other areas where we can apply this process of really working together to identify a target and then work to close it. But before we do that, Sharief, I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit more about some of the programs that you have, because you do this capacity building, you do this education, and you really do this leadership readying for Emirati graduates in the UAE in your security space. So tell us about how you co-develop some of these initiatives and sort of build some of the young leaders of tomorrow.
Thank you. And so for Kaman, again, we ended up with a fairly nice contract back in 2017 or 18 in support of the UAE Armed Forces. For those who don't know, there's an organization called Tawazun that helps a lot of defense contractors. Now that you've helped kind of provide a product to the local armed forces, how are you going to give back to the defense community? How are you going to give back to UAE? And there's many programs. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, is SEEDS. And SEEDS is really designed around sustaining Emirati engineers in the defense sector, is what the acronym stands for. And so it's an easy program where they will link you and try to match you with the best opportunity and the best talent. During COVID, they didn't want to slow down, so they did that virtually. But now that COVID is lifted, they really ask for defense contractors to bring on these engineers, take them to their main facilities back in their native countries, and really spend 6 months to a year growing the talent. And then bringing them back, implanting them in the local industry, having them bring that experience that they gained from their internship and their time to now kind of, build on to that opportunity. What I tell a lot of folks is that the community here, the industry, has been a consumer industry. And so because of the oil wealth for many decades, countries in this part of the world have been able to benefit from having cash to be consumers of goods. Now that we're in that space where we want to evolve to beyond just consumer, we now want to be producers of goods, we need to invest in the human talent. And there are many initiatives out there. We as leaders in the industry have to take the time to identify those tools and use them, because not every tool is designed for what you need. And so we were just fortunate that with our partnership with Tawazun and the SEEDS program, it was the right time, the right opportunity to kind of bring it on board. But ultimately, it's so that we can be now producers of goods and contributors and exporters of goods, right? So it's not just about, okay, we're going to produce widgets here, what are we going to do with it? It's now having the quality seal of approval that now gains global recognition, and they see that this is, a place where the right talent, and the right products are being produced. And so it's very exciting. And to kind of piggyback on my initial story, Mariam actually was competing to be the first woman astronaut to get on the mission over in space. Unfortunately, she didn't make it, but her colleague, a female, has now been identified, and now she's going to be going to outer space. And so imagine Sheikh Zayed 50 years ago. I'm sure as he put this vision, I'm sure he's looking down and being extremely happy and proud of the work that's been done here in such a short period of time.
Thank you, Sharief. You picked up on something I wanted to, a seed, if you will, that I wanted to draw out. I'd like each of you to share a few thoughts on how we can take this model of coming together, a diversity of thinkers and a diversity of leaders, and saying, look, we have endless challenges. What is the one we want to prioritize? And then how are we going to go about closing the gaps a little bit. But to pick up on what Sharief said, and also, if I may, to pick up on something His Excellency Abdullah Luta brought up on Sunday at the SDGs in Action event, we also need young people in the room, right? Because we are all sitting here with our own unique experiences and assumptions, readying also, as Marjorie mentioned in the last session, readying for challenges we may not be around to see. And so how do we engage young people in these kind of coalitions for problem solving? Because we probably need to, right? So I'll start with you, Elena. What are some of the other challenges we can apply this model to, and how can we do more to engage young people?
Well, I mean, I think you already referenced SDGs in action, and I think one of the constant threads that I've been hearing in every discussion so far is that it's collaboration, 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 and partnership. We all have a role to play, public sector, private sector, NGOs, citizens, everybody has a role to play, and we're not actually going to be able to achieve any of the objectives or aspirations of the 2030 agenda without partnership and collaboration. And to me, I think what we've done with the pledge in the last few years is a remarkable example of how you can affect a ripple of change through a number of organizations. And so I look at this and I say, well, I listened on Sunday to all of these panel discussions, and I kept thinking, we have a model for this. We have a model for how to engage across public sector, private sector, international organizations to focus our efforts to tackle complex problems and to do it in a way that builds consensus and to do it in a way that people and organizations are voluntarily signing up for it. So I look at it and I think we talked about education. We talked about climate change. We talked about moving towards net zero. These are things where the engagement starts from day zero, and it's only by bringing everybody on a shared journey that we can move towards greater collaboration. And it doesn't have to be everyone. Sometimes you can have that core group of organizations and individuals who can influence and lead to that ripple effect, just like I referenced in my own organization at Kearney. I mean, we have pushed back into a multinational consulting firm, a ripple of change that is driving us towards new targets around gender. What is to stop us from doing the same around other critical issues that we're already discussing in depth here at the Government Summit now?
Thank you, Elena. Matthew?
I had a different experience last week which references this. We had a futurist come and do a talk who gave us some data around the fact that over the age of 35, you ignore anything new. You won't accept anything new because ultimately your mindset is set. So I'm not sure that the over 35s are the people to solve the problem. And the one thing that he recommended, which I think is a good idea that we're taking back into our organization, is to have a youth board. And if you have a representative youth board of under 35s, because they're the ones that are going to deal with the legacy that we leave, that probably have the answers and the mindset to collaborate that we don't in some respects. And I think any private or government organization can create a shadow youth board that are looking at the problems through a different lens. And in the case of gender, I think we all know what the challenges are, but we're not always the ones facing the challenge or dealing with the issue. We're trying to solve for a population that's coming and a generation that's coming. And one of the things that I reflected on when we were talking is that I was just really lucky to have great female bosses. And not because they were great female bosses, because they were female bosses. So they were just great role models. So I think role modeling is really, really important to have, to see. I was able to see, including my mother, women that worked, that were successful, that had good family values, brought up their kids well, I hope, and then ultimately, pass that on. So in the previous conversation when we talked about work-life balance, you can have it all. But what I see in youth now is a confidence, because they're not coming into the conversation with the same baggage. And I think their energy and their thought processes are very, very different to our own. If we look at our own children, they're way ahead of us on things like ChatGPT. They're way ahead. So let them run with it. Let them run with it.
Thank you, Matthew. That has come up, I think, at every single panel.
Oh, really?
Sharief, some thoughts on leveraging this model to address other challenges and also opportunities, and indeed the opportunities of working with younger people?
Yeah, I'll just have to echo what my panelists have said in that, I think I use this example a lot. My grandfather grew up getting his information through a radio. My father got his information through a black and white TV, and I was the remote control between the two channels. And then obviously my generation, I went from a computer screen that was black with green letters, and I had to learn how to make it follow my commands, to now everything is touch-based. Information is coming at such a rapid pace. And I remember my grandfather looking at my dad saying, he's going to be lost. He's going to watch this evil TV that's going to shape his mind, And I hear that same conversation taking place about my kids, he's getting too much screen time, he's playing too many games, you need to stop that. And really, I keep reflecting back to my grandfather complaining about my dad, and then my dad complaining about me. And now I don't want to fall in that same pattern, thinking that I don't know what my kids are because I don't know what 50 years from now information is going to look like. I mean, we're talking, Elon Musk is talking about implanting chips in people's heads, and you're just going to think, and information is going to come to you. I want to make sure that we're not hurdles at this stage of their growth, and that we, look for opportunities for them to take the tools that they have today and grow on it, and for hopefully a brighter future.
Thank you. That's a very positive note, but I'll offer each of you an opportunity for a last thought. Elena.
I just want to say, so first of all, I think what you both said is fantastic. And I think actually the challenge in some ways is for us as those who are over 35. Although I won't say by how much. But I think the challenge for us is, we can facilitate these dialogues, and we need to facilitate these dialogues and these consultations, but it is also on us to be open enough, to remain flexible enough, like you're speaking about, Sharief, to hear what the young generation has to say. And that's, to me, that is going to be what defines success for us to help create the solutions that our children, our grandchildren, will have to live with the results of. But I think it's an incredible, we have a lot ahead of us to be optimistic about, so.
And I build on that, because I think the big thing that everyone has to work with is their own fixed mindset. We all have fixed mindsets being built based on upbringing, based on religion, based on perspective, based on experiences. The more training we can do around helping people be open-minded to what else may be out there, other opinions, tolerance, which this country has demonstrated, but also an infinite mindset. What we call LQ, which is learning agility versus emotional agility. So the ability to be constantly agile and adapting to everything that's coming, as opposed to having a fixed mindset, oh, it's always been like this, it's never going to change. That's, I think, absolutely key.
I don't know how to match that, but absolutely. And to realize that, again, it's contagious. And if we can continue to be an example, I think, it's interesting to watch what's happening next door in Saudi Arabia as well, where there's a lot of cultural values that are here. And so I think, we're in a very amazing place. And we need to also recognize that, and recognize that this is not normal. This is above normal. This is really something that we can be an example, and something that's contagious that hopefully will spread, not just in the region, but beyond.
Thank you very much to all of you. I think the key learning is that in order to address some of our perceived challenges, it's really about sitting in the same room and having a dialogue, and sometimes that means without an agenda. Thank you to all of you for your thoughts, and to all of you for joining us.